Here's another story that is at once a poser and a teaser. A poser to stir our psychic pot, and a teaser to tease out of us a knowing, a recognition or an awareness. Harun el Rashid was a great sultan, and he'd conquered many territories so that he had a vast kingdom. But not only did he have a vast kingdom, but he had a vast harem, wives, concubines, and the most beautiful of the slaves that were part of those who were captured in his conquerings. But in charge of that harem was an old woman we'll call Felisha. She'd been in charge of the harems of both this sultan and the previous sultan, so she knew the ways of the palace. And not only the palace, but the ways of one who was in charge, like a king or a sultan or an emir. And she also, because she herself had started out as a concubine, knew the ways of women. So all those who came into the harem, she was able to teach them the wiles of women, the way to get attention from the sultan, how to make herself beautiful, how to even win over the guards who were themselves eunuchs, and so forth. So she was well versed in, you could say, the details of the male and the female of the species. But it so happened that Felisha had a grandson. Her daughter had died of a plague many years ago, and she doted on the grandson who was called Akbar. Now when he was very young, he was very timid and very shy. But when he grew to teenage years, Felisha had him become apprenticed to a butcher. So he grew into a very hefty, handsome, accomplished male, in the sense that he knew how to deal with the animals that came, and very adeptly was able to dissect them, and as butchers do. But it so happened that occasionally one of the females in the harem would be allowed out into town, heavily veiled and in a very covered carriage to go into town. And so one day it happened that one of the concubines was taken into town, heavily veiled in her carriage. But when she stepped out of the carriage to go into the jeweler's shop that she was going to inspect the jewelry, Akbar happened to be standing by, and when she lifted her skirt to descend from the carriage, he caught sight of her ankle. And immediately fell in love, smitten, absolutely smitten he was. And from that day on, his grandmother noticed that he was growing thin. He couldn't eat and he couldn't sleep. So finally, she evoked from him what it was. He'd fallen in love. And when he told her who it was, she knew immediately that it was the current favorite concubine of Harun el Rashid himself. So, of course, she said, how can you, there's nothing we can do about that. But she felt so dearly for her beloved grandson that she started to plot and plan. So she told him the only way he was going to be able to be with his beloved was to become Harun el Rashid himself. So from that moment on, she began to tutor him, school him in the habits, the foibles and other things of Harun el Rashid. And she was even able to smuggle out of the palace through her devious means that she'd learned over many years, the costumes that he made, and even some of the sweetmeats that he used to put in his pocket when he went to the harem every night, when he passed through to choose who he was going to spend the night with, that he patted one and gave a sweet to another and so forth. So it was all arranged, and of course the opportunity came when Harun el Rashid was going to go off on a hunting trip, that Akbar could be smuggled into the palace. And so it happened. Harun el Rashid went off on his hunting trip, and Akbar came in, his beard trimmed, looking all for all your life like Harun el Rashid. And of course the eunuchs and the guards and others were quite surprised when he walked down the corridor towards the harem area. But they didn't blink an eye. They thought that Harun el Rashid had just come back early from his hunting trip. So Akbar entered the harem. But of course a little tidbit of the story that was missed out was, of course, when the beautiful concubine stepped out of the carriage and was moving into the jewelry shop, she caught the eyes of Akbar. And she saw the passion there, and of course was smitten herself. So you know how these things are. When Akbar entered the harem, all the women, as they were wont to do, gathered around to try to please him, being coquette-like and so forth. But there was one who stood back from the rest. But she had a quiet smile on her face because she'd immediately recognized Akbar. You know how these things are. And so it happened that Akbar went about his pretense of being Harun el Rashid, and he went down to the various women and he patted one and gave a sweet to another. But of course his eyes were set on the beautiful being at the other side of the room, and he eventually made his way to her, and you know what followed next anyway. They went off into the chamber as was wont to do, and there was a little hanky-panky going on there, as happens, with the beautiful being paying a bit of coquetry, but recognizing who it was and teasing him. How was it that he was so virile now, you know, in comparison with Harun el Rashid? The details you can make yourself. And so it happened that they had a wonderful time. But you guess the rest of the story. Harun el Rashid decided to come back early from his hunting trip. And when he came down the corridor, the eunuchs were very, very confused. How could this be? And of course, when he entered the harem chamber and all the women gathered around, they said, well, how did he get out of the bedchamber? And they couldn't work it out. Well, of course, Akbar and the beautiful maiden came out, and Harun el Rashid said, who are you? And so it was on for young and old. They between themselves, no, I'm Harun el Rashid. And so, the real Harun el Rashid was really incensed by all of this, this upstart and so forth, because he knew who he was after all. But they asked the eunuchs, and half the eunuchs said one was, and the other half said, and the wives and the concubines, there was a great deal of confusion going on, because half said the one and the other. But anyway, it got to fisticuffs. But you can imagine Akbar was a butcher after all. He was quite a hefty male, so he was very quickly able to get Harun el Rashid down on the floor with his knee on his neck. So he had the great advantage with Harun el Rashid begging for his life, please have mercy on me. And Akbar released Harun el Rashid, after eliciting from him a promise that he would not be punished, because he informed Harun el Rashid that he wasn't wanting to take over his kingdom at all. All he wanted to do was have his beloved and be a butcher and live happily ever after with the woman that he loved beyond all else. So Harun el Rashid took this on and gave the promise that he would not punish him in any way at all. In fact, he was quite impressed with the young man's truthfulness and made all kinds of promises that he would give him this and that afterwards. So the story all ends up very happily, with Akbar and his bride living happily ever after, and Harun el Rashid going on with his life as it was, visiting his harem every night and so forth. But of course, out of this story arises several questions in the line of the inquiry we've been pursuing. And that is, since every story is our story, who is the main character in this tale? And looking at, as we have archetypes, what is the archetypal characteristic that stands out for us in this story? Who is the main character? And what is the predominant archetypal characteristic that arises for us out of this story? Is it Harun el Rashid? Is it Felisha? Is it Akbar? Since it's both a pose and a teaser, you don't have to answer straight away.